welcome everybody to today's session. We're going to be quite short and sweet today, so I might be rattling through things at the rate of knots, but please do, as Hansela says, please do use the chat for any questions you might have. And my colleague Pam is also here as well, so she'll be able to help you with any questions you may have. If you are looking for resources, and we don't necessarily need them today, it's more of a sort of just going straight from the slides, but if you want to download the resources or have a look at them, there should be a resources tab on the, I think it's on the bottom bar for you, it's on the top bar for me. So you should be able to access your resources there. But it is, they're fairly basic ones, to be honest. It's basically the question papers and the mark schemes and the examiner reports just to sort of accompany this presentation. So hopefully they're nothing too vital, and just keep your eyes on the screen today and we can go from there. So today is really just what it says on the tin, really. It's just some feedback from the exam series of May and June. So basically the summer exams, and to sort of look at the things that more successful students did as compared to more unsuccessful students, trying to sort of tease out what they did for each of the questions. All of the points I'm taking today, I'm going to shamelessly admit, are all from the examiner report. Obviously there is a lot more to the examiner reports than just these few slides, but you will be able to find a lot more detail in those, and I've just pulled out the salient points. So as I'm talking, please do use the chat, any questions that you've got, and we will obviously address the common issues and answer any FAQs as we go. We're scheduled for an hour, and I haven't done this before, so I've literally got no idea how long it will take, but hopefully we'll get to the hour and we'll be all done, or I might be able to give you a few minutes back, but we'll definitely finish by 5 o'clock. So a fairly basic and easy agenda, hopefully. So it's going to be feedback from paper one. I've realised I've done this twice. So we're not going to do feedback from paper one twice. We're going to do feedback from paper one, feedback from paper two, think about some hints and tips from the examiners, and then any other questions or issues that you may have. So I'm going to start with paper one. I'm going to hope that the same things are not in twice with this, but I don't think they are. I have checked. So we're going to look at sort of just a very quick overview of the paper and what the examiner said. So if those of you can remember back to the sunnier days of May, the paper this year, obviously for paper one, was an extract about Hester, who was looking for Rosamond, who is lost in the snow at night. They're always a little bit angst-ridden sometimes, these, aren't they? This is the Old Nurse's story by Elizabeth Gaskell. And you can see some of the extract is here. And obviously, as always, lots and lots of things that students can choose from, and lots of different, hopefully an interesting extract for them. And obviously, you know, just to remind you, and the examiner, just sort of some general comments from the examiner saying that no candidates found the paper to be engaging and interesting and responded well to it, which is always good to hear and always nice to see. So I'm going to move quickly and look at questions 1 and 2. I'm going to try and emulate what the students should do and be doing AO1 questions relatively quickly. So as you will remember, questions 1 and 2 are focusing on the AO1 assessment objective. And so the first question here was, as always, as we always do with question 1, it's lines 1 to 3. So it's making sure that students are addressing the line references here. Identify a word. So we only need one word, which shows that Hester is looking for Rosamond at night. And what I've done is just pulled some little points from the examiner reports to try and see the main things here. So as it will probably not surprise you, this question was successfully done by the majority of students in the series. Some gave a single word and others gave a phrase containing the correct wording, all of which was awarded the single mark which was available. But you can see here that where candidates were perhaps unsuccessful, they chose a section from outside the given line references, or they chose a section of text which did not answer the question. So it's just making sure that, you know, the students are all there and all making sure that, you know, they're getting their line references and they're getting the right section of the question. What some students do is they will just basically copy out lines 1 to 3. I don't think many do that. That might be a bit of an apocryphal tale, but just copying out lines 1 to 3 is not going to get you the mark. So they do need to make sure they're identifying that word that they want to put in, as it says on the question there. So this one was moonlight, and this one got 1 mark. So you can see here that this was a correct answer. And then likewise, question 2 is also AO1. So that again is that being able to find explicit information, put it down and move on. But here you can see that the command word is slightly different. The students can use their own words or quotation from the text. So they can do whatever whichever suits them best here. Most, I think, tend to use quotation here. But you can see from the box in the bottom left-hand corner that answered successfully by the vast majority of candidates. Most candidates were getting full marks. And actually, just to sort of reiterate with the question, that it develops in question 1 because it asks candidates to focus on a larger section of the text. And those, I haven't put it in the slide here because it takes up too much space, but obviously the section of the text is above this particular question. And it allows candidates to express things in their own words should they wish to. And again, much like question 1, where candidates were unsuccessful, they chose a section from outside the references, or they chose a bit of the text that was in the references, but just didn't answer the question. So here, and actually that second one, this does make you, that's quite an evocative image, that one, isn't it? That it was bitter cold and the air almost took the skin off my face. So it was so cold that was there. So that actually sort of does more than it needs to, perhaps, to achieve the marks available. But it does make use of that 1-2 lines element here, doesn't it? So no, it was bitter cold would have been fine, and no, the air took the skin off my face is a good quotation to think of there, isn't it? So that got 2 marks as well. Right, I'm going to slow down now because I tend to rattle through those 2 just to get that done and dusted. Are there any questions on that before I rattle on and go on to anything else? I'm going to see if I can find my chat. It seems to have disappeared, so let me have a quick look. Hopefully everyone is fine with that. Generally speaking, I think most of your students would have fared well on those questions and got the marks that they were expected to there. So I'm going to move on to question 3, which obviously is a bigger, broader question. So question 3 is here, so you can see it on the slide. That is, read this extract, and there is the extract there. And in the extract, how does the writer use language and structure to show Hester's love for Rosamond and support your views with reference to the text? So here, obviously, just to reiterate, and this is from the examiner report, it's really sort of the notable feature here is that we are asking candidates to comment on both language and structure. And the mark scheme has 3 levels with 2 marks within it. And if you remember from the mark scheme, it does have that element in bold, doesn't it? Saying that, responses that are unbalanced, so only talks about language and/or structure, cannot access level 2 or above. So in order to access marks for level 2 and 3, it's not necessary for the language and structure comments to be equally weighted, only that the answer must contain references to both features. So basically, in sort of layman's terms, if you don't talk about language and structure, you can't get out of level 2. So students have to be very, very aware, and you as teachers, I'm sure, make them aware that they need to talk about both language and structure in this question. So I've put a very small little extract here, and I'm not going to be marking it or looking at it particularly. It's just a little placeholder while I talk. And this is from a level 3 6-mark answer, which is in the examiner report, should you wish to look at it. And I'll put some comments around the edges to sort of talk about what the student has said and what sort of the main student said. But so obviously, because this is a 6-marker, this is a representation of successful responses and what they did. So successful responses, and I've had success and limited success with the ellipses here. Some of these run on quite nicely and some of them don't, so I'm going to apologise in advance for that, but this one does work. So successful responses were those that offered an analysis. I think that's the key thing, being able to analyse both features, so both language and structure, and which were focused upon how the writer used these to present the strong bond that exists between the 2 named characters. And then other successful candidates were thinking about the use of the types of things that they used in their responses were the use of a list of affectionate names, hyphens, repeated use of the possessive my were popular points made in many responses, and many candidates were able to find several relevant things to say about this particular sentence, and that sort of helped them build on the quality of their response towards level 3 analysis. And then other candidates, successful responses were those who were able to sort of offer insights into the sort of the overall structure of the passage, such as recognizing that the extract begins at the height of emotion and tension. And then in the final sentence, does it become clear that things are not quite what they appear? So therefore, intrigue, go sort of thinking about the intrigue, and really sort of playing into the question, making sure that they're answering that question here about sort of, you know, Hester's love for Rosamond. I think that's the other sort of top tip to think about in terms of the question, of this particular question, is it's not just asking about language and structure, it's asking about language and structure in relation to something. So it's making sure that, you know, they are thinking about that relationship between the two characters. Because less successful responses, and again, this is a very small extract that I've just sort of put in there as a placeholder. This was a level 1 sort of 2-mark response overall, and this is on page 22 of your examiner report if you want to look at the overall extract there. So you can sort of see that, you know, obviously this candidate perhaps has been a little bit more clunky. They have sort of thought about the word joy and what it symbolizes, but and they've sort of thought a little bit about the effect on the reader, but it isn't as strong as the other one that we're thinking about there. So the less successful responses, and excuse me when I just move things away from the box that I want to read, perhaps hadn't always read the italicized introduction. So the introduction at the top of the extract is always, again, that's possibly a top tip to get your students to actually read those italics, because it does give them a very good sort of general overview about what the text is talking about. So the italics at the top, and forgive me, I found it on my iPad, so I'm just going to read it out. So in this extract, Hester is looking for Rosamond, a little girl who is lost in the snow at night. Rosamond has been led away into the hills by a strange and ghostly child. Hester is Rosamond's old nursemaid, who has cared for her since her mother's death. So the fact that some students hadn't read that italicized introduction sometimes meant that they confused the relationship. And that some even thought that Hester's loving nickname Lammy was literal and that Rosamond was a lamb rather than the old nursemaid. So I think sort of encouraging your students before they start reading the text to really take on board what's in the italics, because it does sort of set the scene for them, does give them some very sort of important, vital information, which then may help them with this kind of question when they're asking about specific characters. And then perhaps the less successful responses perhaps only wrote about language or structure, or offered comments about sort of, you know, isolated features, and so therefore weren't linking them into the effect that it had on the reader, perhaps even linking it to the question, and then so not sort of able to examine those in detail, and so, you know, and then we're able to reach the marks in level 2 and level 3. So it's thinking about, you know, how students are answering this question. They need to think about the fact that it's focused on, in this case, the relationship, but also it's got to be thinking about sort of the effect on the reader. So not just feature spotting is really the key thing there, isn't it? So that's sort of an overview of perhaps the less successful responses on question 3. And then I'm going to move on to question 4, but if anyone has any questions, please do put them in the chat. Pam and I are very happy to take any questions or offer any points of clarity. As I say, I'm very aware on this course that we do tend to sort of rattle through at a rate of knots along the way. And so I'm going to look at this from Rory. Hello, Rory. It seems from the many scripts I've seen for both paper 1 and paper 2 that language analysis was rewarded, indeed seems to be a differentiator, access the top bands. Yes, so that is your that's your AO2, isn't it? The question you're thinking of, where this is on so Rory, you're thinking about the evaluate questions, aren't you, here? That some students were awarded in the Edexcel CPD, the questions were not language analysis question. No, they're not language analysis. I think where you need to be very careful with AO4, and we'll get onto this, I'll push the slide on now, is that a lot of students will fall into actually answering them as AO2 questions. So they will actually be very language focused rather than evaluation focused. So we always say at the top of our mark schemes that students may include some language analysis or some language terminology, I think is more that we're thinking about. But if they do not have it tied in with an evaluation, then that isn't rewarded on its own. So the fact that some students may have done a bit of language analysis, it may be underpinning their evaluation, and it is the evaluation on question 4 that is rewarded. So it is much more thinking about the students looking at the overall text rather than doing an AO2 question, if that makes sense. And thank you for that. That was a very long question. Thank you for that. And Hilary, yes, I'm looking at this. May not have been familiar with the idea of a nursemaid. That's very true, and I think that's a good point to take on board there. So thank you for that, Hilary. But I think also that she also wasn't a lamb, so I think that was perhaps some of the students got a bit confused with that nickname about Lammy on those sorts of elements there of that sort of way. Yeah, excellent. Thank you very much, Rory. I hope that was helpful. It is that sort of. Yeah, it's often a bit of a conundrum, isn't it, the AO2 and the AO4? But it is, I think, trying to get some clear water for your students around that is the clear thing. I think some students will sometimes go overboard on the AO2 in the AO4 and are not actually analysing anything, evaluating anything. And we want this question 4 to be thinking about evaluation and thinking about that bigger picture rather than that smaller element there. So hopefully that has helped things a little bit here. The overview here is obviously to sort of tests candidates' abilities to evaluate text critically and support their evaluations with appropriate textual references. And the focus of evaluation is sort of saying how well something has been achieved, not merely how it has been achieved. So this again is going to Rory's point. So it's an assessment of the relative success of the writer rather than simply an explanation of the techniques that have been used. And so, as the examiner has said here, it's true that in order to offer a meaningful evaluation, one must be able to show a well-informed understanding of the text and be able to support this with close reference. So it doesn't need to be analysis of the language, it just needs to be close reference to the text. And the focus of the question is about how successfully a writer has attempted to create strong feelings in the reader. So hopefully this was a familiar focus and there were many strong and confident responses to the question. But again, candidates must focus closely on the wording of the question. So it is, in the extract, there's an attempt to create strong feelings in the reader. Evaluate how successfully this is achieved. My sort of linchpin for this and thinking about that is this question is a how well question, whereas a AO2 question, so question 3 is more of a how question. So it's thinking about those sorts of different elements there as well along the way. So successful responses, and again, this is a very small little snapshot here. This was from a level 5 15 mark response, and I'm just going to do some comments around the edges just to sort of give you a flavour of what the other ones were there. So clear that many students had been taught evaluative vocabulary to use in response to this question, but however, the strongest answers were able to apply that in a way that shows evaluation and produce writing that is, and I think that's the key thing in the mark scheme, that it is that sort of critical and detached evaluation. So that sort of overview and that thinking about the different elements there that is the key one to think about. And then candidates, it's focusing closely upon the wording of the question. So it's not just evaluate this text, it's evaluating it in relation to the question. That is the key one as well. And obviously more successful responses were able to do this. And then obviously they didn't just sort of base their responses around broad quotations, which were often repetitions with references used in question 3, but were able to delve deeply into the text and analyse how the writer specifically built up strong feelings and intrigues and how successful they were doing that. So those sort of elements, I think, is another key thing to think about. And then obviously the successful responses also offered sort of wide-ranging evaluations, closely focused on the assessment objective and using sort of apt text selection in support of the points being made. So then less successful responses, and again, I've sort of put that sort of a little extract there. This is a level 2 5 mark response here, sort of just thinking about what were sort of less successful responses, were often quite brief and lacking in the understanding of the relationship and sort of lacking in development there. and also sort of failed to recognise, that the child hadn't perished. Sort of little sort of bits about those sorts of less successful responses, sort of not getting to the main elements there, and perhaps more limited in what they recognised and commented on. Darren, I'm just having a look here. So the comments about evaluative vocabulary were confusing. It's one of those things, Darren, isn't it? Just saying the writer successfully does not an evaluation make. I think it's, so some students, perhaps your weaker students, will just say the writer successfully creates X, Y, and Z, but then doesn't go on to say how they do that. So there always needs to be a because afterwards, or something to support that evaluative vocabulary. So the fact that they are just saying successfully, wonderfully, creatively, whatever, is obviously it's getting them in good habits of thinking about evaluative vocabulary. But if they are not then evaluating or having that critical overview after that, then that isn't really an evaluation. So I think it's just making sure that that evaluative vocabulary isn't just sitting there, that there is something underneath it that fulfills the levels of the mark scheme, if that makes sense. Excellent, thank you, Darren. So some key advice for your students. So this actually was just taken from the back of the examiner report. And I think a lot of you, it looks like you've sort of scoured the examiner report already. So hopefully this is useful, just underlining here. So I think it's remembering that, section A is a test of reading. Read the passage in section A more than once before you start. First reading, look at the main features of the text, what is happening, the main characters, the setting, and then they might just sort of start dipping in and out of it, might they? So the second and third reading, start to identify the different ways in which the writer has engaged you as a reader. And these are what you might start to think about when they write about in your answers. Particular attention to the opening and closing of the text. So this is hopefully some useful things for your students, and see how the writer has shaped their text to initially gain your interest as a reader and then leave them at a particular point. And then also thinking about question 4, remember that you're being asked to evaluate how successfully something has been done, not just comment on the language and structural devices. So use evaluative language, which hopefully, Darren, this is here. And also what I was then saying, not simply enough to introduce evaluative language without writing in an evaluative manner. And also, I think with timing to remind your students. Question 4 is worth more than the first 3 questions added together. So bearing this in mind, this for your students, obviously not you, obviously you know this, when considering how long you should spend on your answer and the level of detail and how much to write there. So, Michael, that's a very interesting question. We get asked this quite a lot, actually. Is it always the case that the writer is successful, or can they discuss ways in which they are unsuccessful? They can absolutely discuss ways that they were unsuccessful, as long as they are doing it with the same amount of rigor, shall we say, and sort of an evaluative comment as they would be around successful. So, for example, and I think it's quite difficult for the 19th century fiction to say that it is unsuccessful without saying, well, it's, a lot of students might fall into a bit more negative by thinking, well, it's old and I didn't understand it. I didn't know what a housemaid was, all of those sorts of things, which isn't evaluation. I think possibly, I don't think I've seen an unsuccessful, where they've talked about it being an unsuccessful in any of the exemplars. I'm sure students possibly have, as long as they are actually genuinely evaluating and saying in an evaluative way why they don't think it was successful, then that is fine. I think there's probably a bit more leeway for it in terms of students for paper 2, because it's a bit more sort of non-fiction or literary non-fiction type texts. So that might lend itself a little bit more to saying, well, actually, it's not for this reader, or it's not for that reader, or, those sorts of things. But I don't know if anyone on the call has encouraged their students to talk about sort of maybe successful or unsuccessful, but certainly for paper 1, I think I've only ever seen sort of they've basically just accepted the premise of the question and said that it was successful along the way. And thank you, Hilary, for that. Yes, can struggle to read the extract 2 or 3 times in the time available. I think it may well be that they're not reading it in total the whole way, but I think, reading it one way, no, reading it through all the way, and then perhaps when you're getting to question 3 and getting to question 4, they're then refreshing themselves, aren't they? Because they go back to those lines and they reread and they think about it from there. So I think this is just sort of some key advice from the examiner. So I think, sort of saying about I think the key thing is it's actually just making sure that they are reading the passage and getting as much from it as they possibly can in order to answer the questions and really engage with them as they go. But I do take your point that, as some students that it's, they want to leave enough time to answer the questions. So I think trying to encourage them at least a good first read and then go back to certain, they can then sort of bunch it up, can't they, and do some pockets of reading along the way there. Right, so I'm going to move on to writing. So we've done a bit of reading, and I'm going to move on to writing now and some feedback from those different elements there. Oh, thank you, Lucy. Yes, some students will sometimes go to the unsuccessful in questions about creating tension. Yeah, I think that's probably quite a good one, isn't it? Seeing it done well. Oh God, the crime and punishment paper. That's a good while ago. Definitely don't see it that often, though. No, I think you're right. I think sometimes it may lend itself, and you're right. Something like tension might be that sort of element here. Yeah. Yeah, I think it's good to see, and I think the examiners will as long as they are evaluating it and they're not saying it's old, it's rubbish, they could have just used a mobile phone and found each other. Then I think that it is quite a nice challenge for some students if they want to think about that. But I do think sometimes just accepting the premise of the question is quite an interesting thing to think about. But yes, hopefully, and thank you, Lucy and Hilary. That's good. Good food for thought there. That in certain things like tension, I can see, yeah, and specific character traits that they can sort of think about. Maybe this wasn't as successful, and give a nice, good, valid reason as to why they don't think it was. So I'm going to move on to writing, and obviously you are probably all familiar with the writing questions, but just to sort of top and tail it really. Obviously there are 2 different questions, question 5 and question 6. It's an either or, so don't do both would be the first bit of advice. I don't think we see that very often, but just to advise students that sometimes in the panic of the paper and sometimes on exam day, it's very easy to get a little bit jittery, isn't it? So the first one was about images, so they could either use those images. They don't have to use those images. It's absolutely fine. Write about a time when you or someone you know made a discovery, or write about a time in your life when someone helped you. So 2 fairly open-ended tasks there, I think, and go along from there along the way. And so just some key tips, and I pulled these out of the examiner report, and they're on page 37 for anyone that might be interested to have a look at the main report, which actually is in your pack if you haven't read it. But just to remind you that there is now a section for candidates to plan their answers, and sort of recommended to do so. And the quality of the plans and the level of thinking they demonstrated obviously will vary considerably. And also sort of just try and move away from simply listing acronyms and things that they might want to include, and sort of focus more on what they'll write about, how they will structure it, the effects and the impressions that they will create and how they will create them. Sort of also think about the effects they are trying to create through their choice of vocabulary. So not just sort of using unusual or ambitious words for the sake of it. And also to be said about sort of punctuation, that some candidates clearly tried hard to incorporate as many different punctuation points as they could, sometimes without sort of consideration of how appropriate or how effective this would be. And Carolyn, yes, these slides are actually in your resources pack now. There is a PDF of them, so you will get those. And Sarah, to what degree are students' responses marked on their correspondence with the keyword in the writing prompts? I think when you think about what AO5 is, Sarah, it's all about how students are responding to audience, purpose, register, etc. So they are marked on that. So if they are not sort of answering the question, and this is a very broad remit, so they are they don't have to do it an actual physical discovery, for example, buried treasure. It can be a more sort of esoteric discovery. and likewise with the someone helped you, but they do have to show that they are answering the question there, because part of AO5 is about sort of building a response that's appropriate to your audience, etc. So I think trying to get your students to answer the question is an important thing to think about there. And then just sort of a very basic thing, really, that, an examiner, and this is again from the examiner report, is just sort of a helpful thing that candidates should perhaps try and avoid. So perhaps those more cliched similes of, I ran like a cheetah down the stairs. And this one, I think, might resonate with some of you about having too many characters for the scale of the writing. So, me and my friends and this, this, and this, loads and loads of different people that might be within the story. And also perhaps trying to avoid some sort of long preamble that might sort of lack interest for the reader before the main action of the story starts. So perhaps a little bit too much of the second bullet point about exactly what all your friends were doing and what they were wearing and what they were saying, whereas actually you actually want to get to that main action and you want to sort of get on with those that main points there. So it's making sure successful writing is characterized by sort of an unerring focus on the reader and different ways in which the writer is deliberately, how their own writing, how they are deliberately using a range of techniques to achieve effects. So making sure that they are picking up on all of those different elements there. And then, so just some successful responses. And again, I sort of included the plan here a little bit because I thought this is what I would be like when trying to remember how to spell ferocious and corrugated. But also, this is a full marker. But also, it is an interesting one in the fact that it's a very small sort of. It's not a very big plan, is it? They obviously had a plan in their own mind, but also thinking about what they will do in their plan. So it's Lucy would help the pirate, but then a lot of it is about how to doing their spelling, isn't it? So I'm looking at Sophie here. Sorry, Sophie. As usual, we're working with students on simpler narratives, and one thing happened. Would that be counted as preamble? No, I don't think that is at all. I think it's more about just that sort of, I don't know what it is. Sometimes students, if it's something about something that happened in their real life, they feel they have to include every single minute detail. So I said this, he said that, then my mum did this, then I had this, then I ate that. So absolutely not getting, if it's part of the sort of building atmosphere and building to something, then that is absolutely great, I think. But if it's just a lot of unnecessary sort of scene setting where actually you could actually sort of start a lot further in and with their story, then I think it's trying to get to the flow of the action as quickly as possible, I think, and having a very definite sense of beginning, middle, and end. Sophie, I think is what they probably mean by that. And yes, and probably the show not tell, sort of building an atmosphere rather than every single minutiae of the plot. About I put my clothes on, I did this, I did that, I did that. You probably don't need a lot of that. It's thinking about your reader and how you're hooking them in from the very beginning. And I think hopefully some of this has probably helped in the examiner report here about question 5 and question 6. So, stronger responses used a variety of techniques, structural and grammatical features, accessible characters, and that idea of a defined narrative structure. And then very strong answers to this task, characterized by a sustained ability to engage the reader through the orchestration of a range of techniques, again, rhetorical devices, extensive vocabulary that sees words and phrases used with subtlety and control. And Rory, because I'm very impressed with Rory's typing skills here. Section B, sort of our sentence scripts need to have their AO6 score pegged. Have a look here. In other words, pupils with less accurate spelling, punctuation, and grammar. What was it? Oh no, I'm sorry. Isn't that Rory? I think it's where was their market guide that tells examiners to look at AO6 within the same. But Rory, as far as that they are marked on separate grids, so there is an AO5 grid and an AO6 grid. So they are marked separately to each other. So they are marked as separate entities, as far as I am aware. I'm just reading because it's obviously quite a lot to read. So I think it's worth, I may not be able to sort of pick up on that too much at the moment, Rory, because obviously where we've got, this is only an hour's course. But to answer your second point, marking guidance, which tells the examiner to only look at AO6 within the same band, no, there isn't. The idea is that they are marked separately. But it may be best if you sort of, this is obviously probably a longer conversation, that you may want to talk to Claire Haviland or someone from the Pearson team about that, because it's obviously there's quite a lot to sort of talk about within this particular course. Maybe we are running a marking course actually fairly soon, so it may be that you want to come along to that and everything else. But it may be that Pam can take your details before we end, and we can sort of finish this conversation at another point. But no, please don't think I'm ignoring you. It's just there's quite a lot to take on board there. But certainly, just to reiterate that the AO5 and AO6 are marked independently of each other. That's why they're in a separate grid. And the marking guidance is that the examiners look at both across the piece there. Right, I'm going to look at less successful responses, and they were often incomplete. So that may well be that there is a timing issue there, and sometimes we're sort of lacking in accuracy and sort of clarity of communication, and some were often sort of struggling with that. And actually, it's interesting that I think that's a good pointer. I think it was Sophie who was saying working on simpler narratives. I think some students sometimes take on sort of quite a wide sort of narrative structure, don't they? And they then struggle to order their events and let it to make sense to the reader. And some markers were talking about sort of that overwriting, where students are trying to cram in lots of complex words. Which is lovely. It's nice to have that ambition, but without discrimination. And sometimes it was at the detriment of the sort of flow of their overall narrative. So it was perhaps not as appropriate as it could have been to the audience and to the purpose, etc. So it's just thinking about, those perhaps less successful responses sometimes can be a little bit overambitious with what they can actually do in the time. I think it's you want to reward ambition, don't you? But if it's it should be almost half a novel that they want to cover their narrative structure on, it is only 45 minutes, so it's thinking about all those different elements as well. So some key advice for writing, it's using the planning box that we've now got would be the key one to think about, sort of the basic outline, so you know where you will start and where you will end. If you have time, sort of thinking about your characters, your vocabulary, the language techniques, etc., in order to help them do that. And that's, as the examiner is saying, perhaps a better use of the planning box than just simply listing punctuation or vocabulary that you might use. Think about their first sentence, try to find a way that grips people at the start, that imaginative idea. Almost thinking of your writing as a journey, so that you know what your destination is and where you will end, trying to get that sort of cohesive and coherent element there, and thinking about the different writing structures. As I know, I can see from your comments that some of you are teaching your students this, that cyclical structure or use of flashback. Thinking about accuracy, obviously spelling, punctuation and grammar, keeping a close eye on the time. I think, and though perhaps with the less successful students, it was, sort of that idea of running out of time, which I'm very conscious we are doing as well at the moment. But sort of making sure that they are leaving enough time for this writing task, I think is a big key part of advice. So I'm going to rattle on because, as I say, I've suddenly realised I've only got 20 minutes left. So I'm going to rattle through the next ones and think about paper 2. And we're going to move on to section A, which was the reading. And we had 2 different texts here. So we had, first of all, we had the extract from This Is Going to Hurt from the Secret Diaries of the Adam Kay memoir, which was 2017. And then we've got the extract from Elizabeth Blackwell, A Doctor's Triumph. And so it was looking at Elizabeth Blackwell and a book about her life there. So 2 sort of different texts for students to get their teeth into. And again, I think, the comments from the chief examiner were that this was an accessible paper, and how it was nice to see the engagement, interest and hard work in the responses that the candidates completed. And examiners were impressed by level of knowledge and engagement with the text, how they actually got through the questions and the time available, judgments at different levels, so that idea of evaluation for AO4, ability to make some meaningful comparisons, writing that showed a range of ideas, the suitable tone, style, and register, and the use of a variety of vocabulary and sentence structure in writing. And perhaps the less successful responses were, struggled to comment on analyze structural points for AO2, perhaps struggled to support their points with textual reference or use textual evidence that didn't really support the points that were being made. This is an interesting one. It doesn't come up very often, but sometimes students are not using the right text for question 3 and question 6. So it's making sure that they use text 1 for question 3 and text 2 for question 6. Sometimes I think in the sort of, again, in that sort of slight panic and muddle of the exam room, that they can sometimes get the wrong text. So it's just making sure that they are doing that. And actually, this is a key one, I would say, thinking about the focus of the question for question 7. So part A and part B both ask a very specific question. So they are not just asking about similarities, as in part A, or text and ideas and perspectives, as in part B. They're asking about something very precise. So it's actually making sure that they're answering the question. And in terms of the writing, less successful responses sort of were lacking a bit of organisation, were connected, but then didn't develop their ideas enough, and also sort of lacked the accurate spelling and secure control of punctuation that we would perhaps be looking for in the better responses. So I'm going to leave out the AO1 questions because obviously we looked at those on paper 1 and they are very similar. And this is the language and structure question for paper 2. So again, it's obviously thinking about the mark scheme and how they have to talk about language and structure. And as the examiner said, pleasing to see that the majority of responses considered both and were encouraged to be aware of instructional points and were able to pick up of elements of language and structure and can use the quotation and references appropriately there. So again, I've put a successful response in the middle, and this was a level 5 response. This got 14 marks and it's on, let me check my page numbers, it's on page 16 of your examiner report. And you can see that more successful responses were showing detailed and confidence analysis of language and structure, and they were weaving the techniques into how this interested and engaged the reader, and were specific about how the effects created were closely linked to their evidence. And we're thinking about the type of text that the extract is from and how it's designed for the reader it was written for. And then we're able to analyse structure in more than the most obvious ways. So thinking about the evolving structure of the text, the sort of positive, enthusiastic opening, and how that sort of contrasted with the sort of monotonous, disappointing reality of things. So thinking about that sort of overall structure and the way that it might have changed along the way. And then also picking up on tone. I think that's usually something that's a sort of higher ability, more successful students will think of in terms of sort of the ironic tone, and were able to explain the sort of written on the walls and how that was an ironic phrase. And also thinking about sort of the type of text and how it was designed and created for a certain reader. And then perhaps the less successful responses, and again, I've put one sort of in the middle there, which I won't go into now because we're not sort of marking today, but this was in the middle of level 2. And all of the little bubbles that are going to appear were on page 16, so you can have a look at these in more detail. But less successful responses were sort of quite generic explanations and were sort of delved into sort of the use of punctuation such as colons, which in itself is not bad. It's just, are they actually making anything sort of meaningful out of that in terms of the effect on the reader? And that's sort of just repeating the question, so indicating that language structure is used to engage and interest the reader, but didn't allow them to meet the higher levels of looking at how these were used to achieve effects and influence the readers. And then also thinking, every time I move this, it covers something else, was sort of feature spotting a little bit without explaining how features are used. And sort of, they again were using the example written on the walls, but perhaps were more taking it without that ironic tone to it. And also sort of thinking about the use of structure, which does remain quite a good discriminator, some quite sort of vague and generalized comments about punctuations and dashes and sentence length. And sort of the least successful responses were just almost sort of paraphrasing a quotation. So explained what the text was about and used quotations to support their narrative. So we're just really sort of giving what the text was about and using the quotations to underline that without thinking about how it's interesting and engaging to the reader. So hopefully some interesting points there around AO2. Do feel free to carry on asking questions, by the way. I am very aware that I'm rattling through this, but I just want to make sure that we're getting through all of it. Caroline, yes, there is a link as well, and maybe someone from the will be able to send you a WeTransfer link. So when you get onto something, perhaps a slightly better Wi-Fi maybe, you will be able to use that WeTransfer link to download the resources as well. So hopefully that will be able to help you. Oh, so but if you can if you copy and paste it to an email or something, we'll get them to you, Caroline. Don't worry, but we will try and make sure that you get there. So here we are, Michael. Can students successfully meet AO2 demands without strictly referring to how readers are interested and engaged? It's a tricky one, Michael, and I'm going to go back and give you all a headache, actually, potentially. So excuse me, because that is sort of part of the question. So it is how the writer used language and structure to interest and engage the reader. So they really do have to try and relate that back to the question. So, and again, as we went through with all the little bubbles, and I'm going to do it again, but I'm not going to do it. I think the less successful responses tended to just repeat that and not actually go on to say how it was either interesting or engaging. They were just sort of copying out the question. So I think that is always the question. So it does really need to keep referring back to that. So I think that's probably a good, it's that sort of old mantra, isn't it, of answering the questions and making sure that they are able to do that. So yes, I think it's they do need to have a nod and be thinking about the reader and how they are interested and engaged in that particular question. So I'm going to talk about evaluate again. So we're back onto AO4. So we've done AO2 and we're going on to AO4. So we're thinking about sort of, being able to think about those judgments and that evaluation and how successfully something was achieved. And this time it was determination, I think, wasn't it? Yes, attempts to demonstrate determination. So candidates in the more mid-levels were perhaps commenting and explaining on the main ideas and events and just offering some sort of straightforward opinion. And as we talked about before in the last paper, perhaps just saying successfully, not necessarily going on to a lot of different elements there. And a vast majority of candidates felt that the writer was successful and were able to do a range of evidence to support their ideas. And they used embedded quotations to support the points being made. And again, I'm going to whiz through this. These ones are more sort of content-based, actually. So successful responses were aware of the changing emotive nature of the text and how it's sort of the progression from her initial revulsion to total focus on becoming a doctor, able to pick up how Elizabeth was going against society and her family, and the more subtle parts of the text, that the fact she has to save up money and various barriers of time and place. And then the most successful responses sort of looked at, this is a good one, they sort of extract in its entirety and sort of thinking about how they are putting across that sort of evaluative language, how they are actually linking it to the question and how they are demonstrating that the writer was successful. So as you can see, probably not so well from these bubbles over it now, but you can see in this one in the middle that they're talking about successful and how it's the next line they're saying it's clearly shown with this and furthermore this. So it's showing the success, but then building on it with the evidence underneath it and sort of underpinning their thing from evaluation there. I'm having a look, Rory. Would it be fair to say that paper 1 evaluation is more about how settings, characters and events are used, with paper 2 more about the progression of ideas? Yes, I think that might be, simply because of the text types. So obviously paper 1 is fiction. So it may well be that those ones that you mentioned are perhaps more relevant to paper 1, whereas paper 2, because they are non-fiction, are perhaps going to be more about ideas and settings and themes. I think characters sometimes come in, don't they? Because sometimes a character can represent a certain theme. and are brought in for a particular reason, or they have a certain dialogue, or they change the sort of focus of the text. I know that the mark scheme always has, settings, ideas, themes, and or events. And because we use the same mark scheme across both papers, that's why we always tend to use those quite broad brushes in the actual levels. We are not expecting students to talk about all of them in all of their answers, if that makes sense. So they are there just to sort of give an idea and actually encourage them to think about bigger picture rather than that minutiae stuff. So generally speaking, I think most things are covered by ideas, themes, settings, events. Some people add an extra, I think they add a P sometimes, don't they, for people and things like that, all of those elements. Darren, we get asked this a lot, and my honest answer is I don't really know. I think a theme, I think they're obviously fairly similar, aren't they? And I think sometimes an idea might be something that might be a little bit more sort of implicit, perhaps. It might be an idea that's not necessarily printed on the writer is sort of drip feeding a little bit of an idea in, or there might be something in the text that's building to a certain idea, or something that might be a little bit more that we're asking the students to infer from it. Whereas a theme, I think, is something that's quite broad and quite all-encompassing, isn't it? So I think it doesn't, if a student says something is a theme when strictly speaking it's an idea, I don't think that necessarily matters. I think what we're looking for is just that bigger, broader brushstroke type thing to think about. But certainly I would think ideas are something that might be a little bit, and Rebecca, you've explained it much more better than I have. I've been struggling, and that's sort of what I'm going to say I meant, that the idea is a light bulb moment and the theme is an umbrella across the whole text. So that is very helpful, Rebecca. I might even steal that from you. So thank you very much. Yes, I think, Sarah, what I would say is that we tend to have that settings, ideas, themes, events as broad brushstrokes. And the examiner hasn't got a checklist and saying, right, I found my setting, I found my theme, I found my event. We have quite a lot of responses that don't actually necessarily mention any of those by name, but they will then, as long as they are evaluating it and they are talking about the different things that are going on in the text that make it successful, and they're pulling in those bigger, wider ideas, then that is absolutely fine. Because I think we sort of talked about it at the beginning, to give students, perhaps your mid-band students and your lower band students, something to hang things onto, to actually say, okay, well, what is it I'm actually trying to evaluate? So you can give them some things to try and find. Whereas I think your higher students are probably going to be naturally, no, they're going to find things for themselves. They're going to evaluate it perhaps more of a holistic way. So I think it probably depends on your students. And if you are finding settings, ideas, themes, events a little bit too sort of constraining, and you want to sort of think about evaluations that are sort of wider, then that's absolutely fine. What the examiner is looking for is those 3 bullets in the mark scheme about that, critical, detached overview, making judgments, all of that sort of thing. And I'm looking at Scott. Would you recommend linking to the type, audience, and purpose of the text so the text successfully meets their purpose through? I would be careful with that, Scott, because actually it is actually asking them to evaluate something specific, isn't it? So it's asking them to evaluate determination. So you might want to talk about the text successfully shows determination through the fact that it is this, and therefore it's so you might want to turn it on its head a little bit. So I think they need to keep the question in mind rather than sort of the way that you are describing it. So I think it's I think all of those are valid, but I think it's what we're trying to get students to do is do that critical overview. So type, audience, purpose may well come into it. They're probably quite good for AO2, to be honest. But I think that is something it's worth thinking about. But I think it's making sure that they are really focusing on the question and looking at how successful the writer is in showing showing the theme of determination. So it might well be that becomes part of their response. But I think having it just as that opening gambit may well not be answering the question quite as successfully as others. I'm going to move on very quickly and just talk about the less successful responses, because I'm very conscious we've only got 5 minutes. We clearly need more time for these. So less successful responses tended to be more narrative based and was sort of focusing on how Elizabeth became a doctor. Didn't necessarily have that critical, sustained judgment, sort of, thinking and sort of, even though they chose relatively okay quotations, were not then evaluating them and talking about that sort of sustained relevant judgment, and perhaps only picked up parts of the text that they thought were effective. So actually sort of almost feature spotted a little bit and over relied on making points about language without actually doing any of that evaluative and judgmental type points there. So I'm going to whiz through, because I'm very conscious that there is one type of question that we haven't really focused on, and that's the question 7. So question 7 obviously is looking across the two texts, and question 7a is around the similarities. So I'm going to sort of leave you to read some of this, because I am conscious we're running out of time. But it's sort of mid-level responses were offering sort of 2 or 3 similarities. The higher level responses were perhaps, giving a more detailed synthesis. What we actually, I think one of the big feedbacks is, and certainly when I was reading the examiner reports, you could see this, was that students are not reading the question properly. So the question isn't about similarities between the texts, but it's about similarities between the people. So it's thinking about that. Some of the students did talk about experiences because they sort of could be linked to the question. But the simplest way of achieving the marks is to find similarities which are linked to the question. And saying things about language are not particularly answering that question. So it's just making sure that students are linking it into the question and that they're not overwriting it. It is, in inverted commas, only 6 marks, which obviously is a decent amount of marks, but it's thinking about, making sure they're leaving enough time for their comparison and their writing, something which I haven't done, obviously. I would say that still stands, Darren, to be perfectly honest. How many similarities are required for 6 marks? In the past, it's been suggested they need 3 separate similarities. I think the key word is separate there, Darren, to be fair. As long as they are very distinct from each other, then that's why I think sometimes schools may well encourage students to do 4, just in case one is very similar to another and then they've got a backup. So I think it's 3 or 4 is absolutely fine. And as I say, and this one, this is a 6 marker and they did 3. So I think it's well worth. This is one why I always recommend looking at the exemplars, because there are some very successful 6 markers and you can see that they have followed a nice strict structure in the fact that they've got one line that says what the similarity is. And then they've got in text 1, it says this, in text 2, it says that, and then they move on. So I think the key to it and the key to success is answering the question and making sure that your similarities are suitably separate from each other. And the 7b is the comparison. And again, the sort of issue here was sometimes the lack of focus on the question. And it's the idea that it's about choosing a career. So it's making sure that students are really focusing on the question here. And I've turned it around here. So the less successful responses perhaps only found sort of 1 or 2 obvious comparisons, and perhaps sometimes just listed points, but didn't develop them properly and sufficiently. And others perhaps sort of considered techniques, etc., but didn't link it into choosing a career. And Sarah, I think we would really encourage students to write in full sentences for 7A. So I think try and avoid getting them to use bullet points. It does need to be full sentences. So very much like the one I just showed you on the slide, it's that trying to get them to write in full sentences would be ideal. Then successful responses, it's about sort of weaving their comparison rather than exploring one text in a paragraph and then looking at it separately, trying to sort of, look at the different things that are going on there along the way. Oh, I'm sorry about that, Sarah. My understanding is, and certainly looking at the exemplars, that the vast majority of the 7A responses are don't have bullet points in them. But if you've obviously heard that from somebody else, but what I tend to advise is that students sort of try and write in full sentences there. Obviously, if they are running out of time, It's obviously putting something better than nothing, but certainly when the exemplars that I've looked at, certainly in the examiner reports, do tend to have full sentences there. But any discrepancy you've got, obviously, if you double check with Claire Haviland on that, she would be the person to give you the sort of definite bit of advice there. Interesting ideas, a way that career choices can be driven by academic ability. So thinking about all the different comparative points there, and thinking about how you actually sort of pull all that together into a nice comparative piece there. I am rattling through this, so apologies. So I will leave you actually with the key advice for the students and let you have a look at that in your own time, and just very quickly finish off with the writing. It's actually quite similar to the imaginative writing, about thinking about sort of their audience and their purpose, and making sure that they are sort of, it's got a very definite overall feel and overall element to it there, and thinking about their tone and their style and their register. And thinking about their AO5, and has it been written appropriately for audience and purpose, and what do they want to do with their writing? Are they arguing a case? All of those sorts of things. So there's some nice key advice there. And also some nice key advice, hopefully, for AO6 about the successful responses, a wide range of accurate and ambitious vocabulary. And perhaps the less successful responses seem to have in the more frequent errors, all of those types of things. So Belinda, sorry about that. I am conscious that I'm running out of time here, but yes, 7B is obviously the wider question. So ideas and perspectives. Ideas is probably something that is what most students can find. So it's the main things that are happening in the text. So the main different elements, whereas perspectives is more about the viewpoint of the writer and where they are coming from and the different things that they might be considering there. And that often is a little bit of a differentiator. So, for example, thinking about tone, or thinking about sort of their motivations for writing that text. Are they thinking about all of those different elements? So it's really thinking about sort of the ideas are perhaps where the more obvious comparisons may come in, but then the perspectives is that more reading between the lines, thinking about all the different sort of ways the writer is putting things across. So things like the overall voice, the overall tone, all of that sort of thing. Sophie, I'm just having a little look. Is there always be a question that could be used to generate debate, argument, persuade? I think so. It's generally the transactional writing is about exactly that. So it's always something. Let me go back to this year's questions. So this is guide giving advice to young people on choosing a career, and the other one is an article for a magazine about my ambitions for life. So I think both of those could fall into that that book, can't it? And I do think that is useful about being able to generate debate, argument, persuade. And I think, as the examiner has said, it's actually thinking about what your writing is for, what is your end point, what do you want the reader to do or think about at the end of it, I think is always a good thing to think about. So I think you're very much on the right lines there, Sophie. For 7B, do candidates need to write 3 paragraphs? I think it's with all of those things, Michael, there isn't really a set amount of paragraphs. I think it's thinking about how many, is there a wide range of comparison? Are they pulling together sort of, the big ideas and then showing how they are similar and different, and the ways in which writers are doing that in terms of ideas and perspectives? So again, I will direct you to the exemplars because I think that can give you a good idea, but I think it's much more about thinking about what they're actually, have they read both of the texts? Have they thought about what's going on in relation to the question? And then thinking about the ways that those ideas or perspectives are conveyed similarly or differently. So there isn't really a set amount in that way. And I do appreciate that, worried students don't have enough time. So it's well worth having a look at some of the exemplars and seeing what other students have done in the past and thinking about all those different elements involved there. So as I say, I'm very conscious that I have really gabbled through this last bit because obviously we didn't leave enough time, or I put far too much information in the pack. But you will get these slides at the end. I'm happy to hang around for sort of 5 minutes or so if there are any other questions that anyone wants to ask, because as I say, I'm aware that we've got through this rather quickly today and you all had some really interesting questions. So thank you very much for that. So any other questions, do please put them in the chat and I'll be happy to address them. But also I am reminded that you are supposed to finish at 5 o'clock and you may well have other things you need to do. So if there are any other questions or anything you wanted to raise about this, obviously do contact Claire Haviland at Teaching English. I'm going to put it in the chat for you so you can see it. So it's teachingenglish@pearson.com. And she will be able to help. But as I say, I am happy to hang around and talk to you a little bit more if you've got any other questions that you really wanted to get off your chest. And hopefully that was useful. And thinking about just sort of giving you a very quick overview. As I say, apologies that it was all a bit quick. And I know some of you had some quite specific questions that you wanted answers. So I'm hoping there was some nice, useful bits for you there. Any questions, anything that you want clarity for, obviously do contact Claire Haviland because she is a very useful source that you can go on to. And Belinda, could the exam board please offer more specific advice and teaching materials on 7B? We can certainly take that back. My colleague Pam is in the chat today, so we can certainly have a look at some more advice on that. There should be some materials on the website about there are some schemes of work and there are some lesson plans of which I'm fairly sure comparison is in there. But please, obviously, we will have a look at that, Belinda, and see what we can do for you. So thank you all very much for coming today. And as I say, I'm sorry I went like the absolute speed of light at the end, but hopefully there was enough food for thought there. And thank you all so much for your questions and have a lovely evening. And I'll go to there we are, to the Pearson thing. So thank you all very much for coming today.